Today, we're exploring the most incredible comeback narratives in history, starting with Alfred the Great. It's April of 871, and the British island has been converted into a battlefield. While modest Viking raiding parties had assaulted Britain's coastline for decades, this occasion was vastly different. 6 years earlier, hundreds of Viking vessels arrived in East Anglia, and the great heathen army numbering in the thousands stepped onto British territory with their spouses, offspring, and craftsmen. This force had zero interest in mere pillaging. This time they arrived as invaders determined to conquer. The Vikings were merciless combatants, and within 2 years, the formerly powerful English kingdoms of Northumbria and East Anglia had collapsed under their domination. In 871, the heathen army finally directs its focus toward the kingdom of Wessex, and King Ethelred and his brother Alfred march their forces into combat against the Viking attackers. The two armies clash in 9 savage battles spanning a year, and advantage shifts repeatedly like a championship boxing match. But soon, additional Viking reinforcements land in Britain, and their forces are simply overwhelming for Ethelred's army of drafted farmers and tradesmen. In the Battle of Merton, the king suffers wounds, and he shortly perishes from his injuries. The 22-year-old Alfred grieves the death of his fourth and last brother. He never desired to be monarch. He had envisioned a peaceful existence, filled with studying and discovering the marvels of the world. But now he was the sole survivor, and the terrible burden for commanding his people against the most dangerous threat his kingdom had ever encountered was forced upon his shoulders. As Alfred was arranging his brother's funeral ceremony, the Vikings struck again, obliterating what remained of his already devastated army. With no alternative choices, Alfred compensates the Vikings to depart. The great heathen army accepts the wealth and proceeds to assault the neighboring kingdom of Mercia. They are unstoppable, and by 875, Alfred's kingdom of Wessex is the final remaining English kingdom independent of Viking control. With the total domination of the island appearing like a certainty, more Danes flood into Britain, and the Viking army in the south, commanded by a fearsome man named Guthrum, recognizes an opportunity to eliminate the last stronghold of English independence. He assembles his warriors and advances towards Wessex. Now, Alfred was in an extremely dire situation when he bribed the Vikings the previous time. But he didn't squander the time he had purchased and had completely reconstructed his army. He was prepared for them, and while the Vikings are plundering the town of Wareham, he corners them in the settlement. As vigorously as Alfred attempts to drive them out, the Vikings demonstrate to be quite skilled at enduring sieges. And eventually, Alfred resorts to negotiation instead. "All right, now I need you fellows to solemnly swear on that ring you possess there that you mentioned was for your deity, Thor, correct? Okay. Pledge on that ring that you'll return the captives and leave us in peace." Music. Excellent. All right, I'll be right back to retrieve those captives. See, gentlemen, I told you just a bit of diplomacy goes a long way. But they solemnly pledged to Thor. Guthrum had zero reservations breaking promises and agreements he made, even one sworn to one of his Norse deities. And as soon as Alfred departed, he executed all of their captives and escaped to Exeter to await reinforcements. Alfred relocated to the coast and prevented said reinforcements from arriving. And soon the Viking vessels were all destroyed offshore in a tempest. With no support, Guthrum and his fighters retreated back to Mercia. Though Alfred is on extreme alert, there are no observations of the Vikings in Wessex for an entire year, and eventually he comes to believe he had triumphed in the war. He had protected his kingdom from the invaders, and delivered peace to his territory. So in January of 878, To commemorate the triumph against the heathen invaders, Alfred organizes a Christmas banquet in Chippenham, away from his fortified capital, and invites lords and aristocrats, his finest soldiers and clergy, to come and commemorate the birth of their Savior and the newfound peace in Wessex. Little did they realize this was precisely what Guthrum was anticipating for. As Alfred and his men are celebrating, a loud rumbling starts to intensify outside the hall. The king and his attendees attempt to see what the disturbance is when suddenly massive Viking warriors burst through the entrances and commence slaughtering everyone within reach. They had discovered that Christmas was a sacred day for the Saxons and realized that this would be the ideal time to attack. Alfred and his soldiers are weaponless for the holy celebration, and the Vikings ruthlessly tear through the dinner attendees. Amid the pandemonium, the king and a small group of bodyguards escape into the marshland, while the remaining dinner attendees scream in agony as they are massacred. Alfred runs until he reaches Somerset. Exhausted and filthy, he is sheltered by an elderly peasant woman who feels compassion for this desperate man. She has no knowledge he is her king, and she requests him to monitor some of her cakes she had positioned near the fire to bake. Alfred consents, but as he stares into the flames, his mind races between thoughts of self-pity and desperation to rescue his kingdom. 7 years I contained them, purchased them with gold when I had to, battled the best I could. One bloody night, that's all it required. One night, and the 7 years were all for nothing. I could still hear them shrieking. My people, my household guard. They perished so I could flee. Loyal men, honorable men, die defending a king who deserted them. What kind of king flees while his warriors die? What kind of king monitors cakes by a fire? Oh no, I instructed you not to burn the cakes. As the king sat there being scolded by that elderly peasant woman, it's difficult to imagine why he didn't simply surrender then and there. Most would. Heck, the king of Mercia escaped to Rome when the Vikings came for him. But Alfred was different. He apologizes to the woman for her cakes and departs with a calm intensity. Perhaps it was because he was deeply religious and he believes God was testing him like many great kings in the past. Or perhaps it was simply because he wanted vengeance for Guthrum destroying his Christmas dinner. Whatever the reason, after months spent reviewing all of his alternatives, Alfred decides to risk it all on the line and to attempt to resist one final time against the Vikings. He dispatches a call to every able-bodied man to take up their sword and join him to combat against these invaders. He calls on them to assemble at Egbert's Stone on the 7th week after Easter, and together they will fight not as kings, nobles, farmers, or merchants, but instead they will fight together as English. But was there anyone remaining to hear his call to arms? The Vikings had eliminated his finest soldiers at the Christmas assault. Many nobles, expecting the collapse of Wessex, had betrayed their king or escaped the island altogether. Well aware that he may be marching to not just his own death, but the death of his kingdom, Alfred prepares what's left of his decimated army and rides for Egbert's Stone. As he approaches the rendezvous point, his worst fears begin to race through his mind. What if no one is there? What if his message never reached his people? Or even worse, what if they had lost confidence in their king? But as Alfred crests the final hill that overlooks Egbert's Stone, he is welcomed with the roar of 4,000 men. Their swords raised, they cheer their king as he rides towards them. They had all heard his call and were all prepared to fight to defend their homeland. Alfred leads this army to confront Guthrum at the Battle of Edington. Leading from the front lines, Alfred and his men engaged the Vikings in brutal melee combat for hours, until finally they break the will of the great heathen army. Guthrum and his remaining men flee the battle with Alfred and his men cutting down anyone they could catch. The Vikings eventually make it to Chippenham, the same town that they had attacked Alfred during his Christmas feast. Alfred besieges the town for weeks, starving the Vikings until Guthrum finally surrenders. The warlord expects the king to execute his entire army, but instead, Alfred does something no one could have ever imagined in 1,000 years. He tells the Vikings that if they wish to surrender, he will permit it. But first, Guthrum must be baptized and convert to Christianity. Then all Vikings must leave Wessex and never return. Guthrum, thinking that this alternative is much better than being turned into a blood murderer, Eagle agrees and is baptized. Alfred actually becomes his godfather, and after being treated like family for a few weeks, the reformed warlord takes his Viking army and goes back to East Anglia. Now, Alfred had already been deceived by Guthrum multiple times, who had shown no respect for any religion, including his own Norse one. So, to most people, it probably seemed like he would just do the same thing again. But perhaps the most surprising thing about this story is that for some reason it seems like the Viking warlord actually takes his religious conversion seriously. He begins using his Christian name and never attacks Alfred or Wessex again. He ruled his kingdom known as the Danelaw until his death as a peaceful king. As for Alfred, his comeback story against the Vikings alone would have made him a legend in itself. But he goes on to accomplish so much more. He completely reforms his kingdom's military, making it more powerful than ever. He creates the first English navy and finally led a cultural renaissance, translating texts from Latin to English. He spends his days dreaming of a day when there were no borders separating the kingdoms of the land, a day when all the English are united as one. And when he retakes London from the Vikings in 886, he does so not as the king of Wessex, but as the king of the Anglo-Saxons. His son would inherit the now powerful kingdom that he had rescued from the brink of annihilation. And eventually his grandson would conquer the last Viking kingdom on the island and become the first king of England. For all the things he accomplished in his relatively short life, Alfred is the only English king to ever be given the title the Great. Sundiata Keita. It's the beginning of the 13th century, and in a small corner of the once magnificent empire of Ghana lies a tiny kingdom called Kangaba, which is ruled by a king named Nare Maghan. Though his kingdom is small, his people adore him, and he is a fair and just ruler, the Ka. Citizens of Kangaba feel fortunate to reside here, as they have heard horror stories from other lands throughout the now collapsed empire. Most notably, stories of a tyrant king named Sumaoro, who has seized control of the Soso region, where he rules through fear and violence. But Kangaba is distant from Soso, and the king and his people live a peaceful life. But little did they realize that their tiny kingdom was destined to give birth to one of the greatest kings in the history of Africa. One day, Nare Maghan is sitting under a tree with his advisors when a hunter from a foreign land approaches with a gift, a thank you for permitting him to hunt in his peaceful lands. The king accepts the gift and learns the hunter is from the land of Sangaran. The hunters of Sangaran are said to be soothsayers, powerful mystics who can see the future, and he requests this hunter to tell him what God has in store for him. The hunter agrees and produces shells from his satchel that he will use to peer into the king's future. Staring intensely at the shells, the hunter moves them around. He looks up at the king and says, "Your successor is not yet born." What do you mean?" asks the king. "He has a fine son birthed from a beautiful woman named Sasuma." But the hunter shakes his head and continues, 2 hunters will one day bring a woman from far away to you. She will be hideous, the ugliest woman you have ever seen, with eyes that look to be laid on her face and a huge hump on her back. Right. I think I'll stick with Sasuma. She will be so ugly people will call her the Buffalo Woman. But you must marry her, for she will be the mother of him, the mightiest king, who will be a lion so great that this land will be known forever. All right. A few days later, 2 hunters do arrive and bring with them a woman that they offer to the king as a gift. She is by far the ugliest woman he has ever seen, and so he marries her because, prophecy and stuff. The woman is named Sogolon, and soon she becomes pregnant and gives birth to a boy. He is given the name Sundiata, and the king is excited. The Lion King, his true successor, has been born, but the excitement soon turns into disappointment as the child grows and it becomes obvious he is disabled. He never learns to walk, and at the age of 3 is still crawling around, dragging his legs behind him. The king's previous wife, Sasuma, sees this and laughs. She brings her son near Sogolon and says, "Come, my son, walk, jump, leap about." And as her son pranced in front of Sundiata, she says, "I prefer a son who walks on his 2 legs to a lion that crawls on the ground and walks away cackling with her son jumping after her." Sogolon tries everything to heal her son's legs. She researches and tries every herb she can find, but nothing works, and the king is growing more and more disappointed by the day. Maybe Sundiata was not to be the future king, so he tried to make more children with Sogolon. She becomes pregnant again, but the king is disappointed when she gives birth to a daughter, one who is just as ugly as she is. She gets pregnant again and gives birth to another boy. But when he checks with his spiritual guides, they tell him this child will be the right hand of the king of prophecy, not the king himself. The king doesn't know what to do. He trusts the prophecy, but it seems so wrong. When Sundiata turns 7, he is still not walking, and the king is nearing death, still believing in the prophecy given to him by the hunter. His last words are to hand his kingdom to Sundiata, but his advisers refuse, a disabled child as their king. They would appear weak and would surely be conquered by a neighboring kingdom. So they give the throne to the son of Sasuma instead. The next day, Sogolon stares at her son lying on his stomach, eating from a bowl on the ground like an animal. She had done everything she could for him, but the prophecy was wrong. She can no longer hold back. Her tears and breaks down and cries. Sundiata finishes his meal and looks to his mother. "Do not cry," he says. "I will show you. I will show you today that I can walk." He crawls to the village blacksmith and asks him to give him an iron rod. In front of a crowd, Sundiata grabs the rod and, while laying on the ground, stands it up vertically. He then slowly uses the bar to pull himself up. He strains every muscle in his body, but slowly he rises to a knee. The bar bends, and with sweat streaming down his face. Sundiata pushes himself up off the ground. He releases the iron rod from his grasp and stands for the first time on his own 2 feet. The crowd erupts into cheers. "The lion walks," they shout. From here, Sundiata quickly grows stronger and stronger, and soon the people in the kingdom begin to believe in the prophecy again. Maybe he actually is the Lion King. And all of this enrages Sasuma, and she begins to plot to have Sundiata assassinated to protect her son's place as king. Fearing for her child's life, Sogolon takes Sundiata, and together they flee the village in the still of the night. They wander for 7 years, bouncing from kingdom to kingdom. The hardships make Sundiata stronger, and he eventually finds his way to the kingdom of Mima. By this time, Sundiata had grown to be a powerful man. He joins their army, and when he fights in a war with the Mima king, his bravery on the battlefield is noticed, and he deems Sundiata worthy of the Mima throne. But Sogolon, now sick and on her deathbed, reminds her son that his destiny is not here in Mema, but back in their home village. One day, merchants from Sundiata's homeland arrive. They are brought to Sundiata, and when they see him, they fall to their knees and begin to cry. "We have left our home 2 months ago disguised as merchants, but in reality we have been searching for you. The tyrant Sumaoro has invaded our home. Our king and his mother have fled and left us all alone. We continue to fight, but we have no leader. The soothsayers have told us that only the son of Sogolon can save us, and we are now saved because we have finally found you. Sundiata, our Lion King, your father's throne awaits you." Upon hearing this, Sundiata thinks of his mother. She had died, hoping the prophecy would one day come true. He gathers the army in Mema and visits all of the small kingdoms he had visited. After leaving his home, he tells these kings of Sumaoro, and how, if they desire their freedom, they must unite to defeat him once and for all. His army becomes larger and larger with each stop, and he leads this unified force in the Battle of Quirina, where Sumaoro and his forces are defeated. Following the battle, the kings who had joined Sundiata kneel down before him and give him the title of Mansa, the King of Kings. This new land he will rule will come to be known as Mali, a glorious empire with vast gold mines and salt beds that becomes one of the richest empires in the history of the world, one that would become so wealthy that Sundiata's descendant, Mansa Musa, is still regarded today as the richest person to have ever walked the earth.